all, not Louisa's story, but more about why are we doing this? Why are we telling stories at church as a part of a spiritual formation offering? And so some of you will know more about this than I do, but I want to just begin by talking about our scriptures, how our holy scriptures are really consists of a whole bunch of stories. It's 66 books full of stories. There's some poetry, there's songs in it, there are things like that, but they're also just stories. Stories that tell of a people who have gone through all kinds of times. And even if we begin just with the beginning of Genesis, there's a story about creation that was created, right? A story that tells us of how the earth began, and it's a story that humans came up with, inspired by God, to try to make meaning out of how this whole world came to be. It's a story, and under that story of creation, there's truth in it, right? There's something to be learned, something to grow from and to be nourished from that story. And the same is true throughout scriptures. I told the group there's going to be a whole series of people who tell stories, and I told them that one of the reasons in particular that I'm drawn to this kind of work is from a story in the Old Testament. It's a story of the children of Israel as they are crossing over. So there's the crossing over on the Red Sea, right? Moses leads them. There's a whole big movie about that. You guys know that, right? That's one of the stories we know if we've made it a movie. There's another story of where the children of Israel are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they're crossing over a river, and the river stands up. It stands up on one side so that they can cross over and the Ark of the Covenant not get wet. And after they cross over, the leader says to them, I want you to take 12 stones and to put them here. And each stone represents one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the people ask, why should we place these stones here? And the leader responds, because I want people to ask, when they see these stones, what do they mean? And we will tell them that this is the sign that of how we got over, of how we crossed over from one side to the other. This is a monument, a memorial of that. This is a stone. These stones help us remember the story of how we got over. And so the stories that you all will hear both today and across this series will be stories that will remind people of how they were transformed and changed in some way, of how they got over, perhaps from one side of grief to another, or perhaps a story of how they may have even just grown up or come from one side of believing about what people of color look like and what you should think about that, to how they came to another side. I want to say one other word about stories. We read the same ones over and over and over again in church. In the Gospels, I don't know if you've paid attention, but over the course of the years, we just circle back around every 3 years, and sometimes we repeat the same story. For instance, on Good Friday, Palm Sunday, we repeat the same story over and over again. And as a preacher, my task is always to hear that story and to see what new bubbles up. And as listeners, as readers, as people of faith, that is your task too. To hear what is in the story, and even though you may have heard it literally 100 times, to hear what new truth emerges. Each of you will hear Louisa's story today, and you will hear something different because we all hear those from different perspectives. But what I am clear in your hearing is that there will be some truths that will rise up for you that can be instructive to how you might get through, of how you might live your life perhaps a little differently. And in this storytelling, the last thing that I want to say, and Simon kind of keyed me up for this in his sermon. If you haven't heard his sermon yet, then it's a spoiler alert. But he called us to get proximate with one another, to draw nearer to one another. One of the ways that we draw closer to one another is through our sharing of stories, and the telling of stories about more intimate, more vulnerable times in our lives. And so I want to thank Louisa for drawing nearer to us, particularly in this season, when it can be our instinct to pull away. certainly can be my instinct to pull away. And so I am grateful that Louisa is prepared to offer us a story in which she draws near to us as we seek to hear how God is working throughout our stories. Louisa.
Nearly 2 decades ago, when I was right around the corner from turning 30, my life was falling apart. The woman that I was in love with had just told me that she could never see me again. And my mother had received a diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. In a nearly catatonic state of grief, I decided to try to jolt myself back into living by flying to Mexico alone for a week to try to get it together. I will never forget that my mother, who, as you can see in this picture, was always like very nicely dressed and accessorized. Isn't she nicely dressed and accessorized? Girl, don't make fun of my mother. This is 1993, okay? She looks good. Drove me to the airport in her bathrobe and did not say a word to me about my going by myself. I chose Veracruz as my destination because I had seen this picture online of couples my parents' age dancing in the town square under the full moon, and it comforted me. Also, there was the beach. When I arrived, I spent 5 days eating papaya and yogurt in the hotel restaurant and going back up to my room to sob and sleep. On the 6th day, my body was so dull and sore from inactivity that I couldn't stand it anymore, and I decided I had to leave the room and go for a walk. I ended up in a residential neighborhood just as school was letting out. Hordes of kids in Catholic school uniforms flooded the cobblestone street. They were jostling around me and grabbing at each other, and when the sea of blue and black plaid jumpers parted, I found myself standing behind a wheelchair that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The man sitting in the wheelchair grinned at me, stuck his hand out, and said in a thick Boston accent, like a mafioso, "Hi, my name's Anthony." And when I looked confused, having never met a Mexican man named Anthony before, he said, "They call me that up north because nobody can pronounce Ovidio." Oh, Ovid, I say. He was a Roman poet who wrote this amazing long poem called the Metamorphoses. We agree that that's what I'll call him. He has an electric smile. Ovidio lived in Massachusetts for 15 years, and he would be there still if he hadn't gotten deported. I was at this New Year's Eve party and had too many, you know what I mean. This guy, he starts in with me, so I stab him a little. I pause here. Ovidio, how can you stab someone a little? He deserved it, man, I swear. So anyway, they sent me to court. The judge found out my papers were fake and told me he was sending my crippled butt back to where it came from. He didn't give me no first class or nothing. He threw me down there with the luggage on La Migra Airlines. He looks up behind him where I have fallen into place, pushing his chair. We laugh. We come out of the residential neighborhood onto the Malecon, a long stretch of harbor with ocean glimmering between thatched roof huts selling glorias, papaya, nieves, and sincronizadas. I ask him what a sincronizada is, and he doesn't know. I'm like, how is it that you're Mexican and don't know what a sincronizada is? He says, I'm more American than you are, sweet pea. A man in a thatched roof hut selling nieves yells out, "Hey, gordito!" And I bristle and look at Ovidio to see if he's offended, but he just laughs and says, in America, if somebody yells out, "Hey, fatso!" you're like, are you talking to me? Are you talking to me? But in Mexico, we just touch our stomachs and wave like it's a compliment. We think this is so funny that we decide to go around the Malecon yelling, "Hey, gordito!" at each other and taking pictures of ourselves doing just that. When I was looking through these very old pictures, I could not find a picture of Ovidio doing that, unfortunately, but it's amazing that I've been able to keep these pictures for 20 years. This is what he looks like. He's not smiling in this picture, but you're going to get to see him smile in a second. So from that column that I was standing on in that picture back there, I could see this man sitting on a park bench. He was staring down at his hands, looking like horribly depressed. And Ovidio goes, "Would you look at this guy? You think he could smile just once. Why don't you go over and sit next to him?" And I'm like shaking my head like, no way. When he yells out, "Hey, she wants to have her picture taken with you." And I was gonna say no, but then I'm like, okay. So I climb down off the column, I walk across the way, and I sit down next to the man. Ovidio is holding the camera up and goes, "She told me she thinks you're cute." The guy looks up from his hands and smiles. Ovidio snaps the picture. Then a man whose name is Rafa comes running up in blue Umbro shorts and dark sunglasses and asks us if we want to rent a boat to go out to the island of Sacrificios. Ovidio is looking at me skeptically. There's no way to get the chair across the sand, but Rafa says that's okay. We can go over to the docks and they can lift the chair in the boat. I say, "It's my treat if you want to go, but we don't have to. We can do something else." And he's like, I'll wait here for you. You go ahead. And I'm like, "We could go to the aquarium." And he's like, long pause. No. Once in a lifetime, right? Okay, let's go. And he says to Rafa, "You're not going to botarme, are you?" And I don't know what botarme means, but I can only assume it means something like drop my butt in the water. Rafa assures us that is not going to happen. And so we make our way to the docks. Rafa and his partner lift the chair, and Ovidio's jaw is clenched. I have to look away until they get him settled safely into the back of the boat. 3 perplexed-looking Mexican businessmen on vacation are staring at us from the prow of the boat. A man in a ruined hat paddles by in a wooden dinghy. He has a huge Ziploc bag of sandwiches that he pulls out of a fishing bucket, and he's like signaling to us to buy one. Ovidio goes, "Would you look at this, Popeye?" "No, I mean, it's great. Us Mexicans, we're all entrepreneurs." When the boat gets going, the waves are much rougher than I had imagined. I have to throw my legs over his chair to keep it from moving around the boat, and we are both gripping so tightly and laughing so hard, I can't tell if the salt stinging my eyes is from the ocean or tears. Ovidio points at the Mexican tourist looking at us and says over the pounding of the waves, They are looking at us like we are lunatics. Rafa takes us to a coral reef where we can swim with yellow fish with bright blue stripes. Ovidio hauls himself up out of his chair and launches himself off the side of the boat. Wow, I yell, running with my arms out to the side of the boat. He bobs up out of the water and looks at me and is like, what? I told you I could swim. The Mexican businessmen are looking at my dark shorts and my white shirt, and I'm thinking, I'm really far from my hotel, but what the hey, I'll dry. So I'm standing on the edge of the boat, about to dive in, when I look down and I see in the seat of Ovidio's chair a tiny pair of sewing scissors, like the kind that you use to cut thread. And I hold it up, the silvers glinting in the sun, and I go, Ovidio, what's this? And he goes, oh, that's my shank. And I go, you weren't kidding when you said you stabbed him a little, were you? He's grinning up at me like crazy. I drop the scissors and dive. The water is calm now. Little yellow fish are nibbling on us. He says, like this, he almost feels normal again. Like this, he remembers how to dance. By the time we get back to the Malecón, it's dark. And I cannot believe that not one bus in this city is handicapped accessible. Not one. The sidewalks are crowded with people, and it's too hard to lift his chair at every curb because there are no curb cuts. So I push us into the street. Traffic is horrible. So I'm running, pushing the chair, trying to squeeze us in as close as I can get to parked cars. Buses, like belching monsters, scorch past us, throwing soot and fumes into our faces. A man on a rusty bicycle rides by, pulling a wagon loaded with huge jars of pickled eggs. A car driven by 3 teenagers almost crashes because they are staring at us so hard. We must have looked like we came out of fire. By the time we get back to my hotel, we're covered in grime. Ovidio says he can make it the rest of the way back to the church where he sleeps by himself. I'm actually leaving the next day, and it turns out that he is also going to go to the bus station in the morning in Veracruz to catch a bus to Mexico City to try to get a coyote to take him back over across the border. I ask him, how did he get over the first time? And he tells me, then I was a child and they carried me. Now I'm a man and I have to do it on my own. We agreed to meet at 10:30 the next morning at the bus station. It's 11:15 and he's late, but I think buses leave here every hour to go to Mexico City, so I'll wait a little while longer. I'm sitting next to a little girl who's pulling on a bottle of colored water that her brother is hogging and starts to whine. Her grandmother pulls the bottle out of the boy's hand and hands it to the little girl, who sneers in triumph, and then I see him from a distance. Ovidio, I yell. Ovidio, she yells, imitating me, and the grandmother says, stop it. Then I see him closer, and his clothes are ruined. They're just filthy, and his wheelchair is all messed up. The wheels are like bent up against the body of the chair and strung up with wire. What happened? He tells me that last night he was robbed. He had gotten back to the church where he slept past curfew, and they wouldn't let him in. So he had to go and sleep in a park. When he woke up this morning, his bag, the 200 pesos that he had been saving for his Mexico City bus ticket, and all of his original documents were gone. I don't know what to say. An American voice inside of me says, here comes the scam. and a larger, more real voice that I believe inside of me says, he's the same as you. So I tell him I'll buy him a bus ticket to Mexico City. But he says no, he can't go anywhere until he goes all the way back down to Chiapas to get his paperwork. So we go over to a bus station restaurant, and I make him order some food. A man in a torn shirt with lesions on his chest comes over to Ovidio and is coughing. Dang, man, Ovidio says, holding him away with an extended arm. Cover your mouth. The man sticks his hand out like this. Ovidio goes, why are you asking me for money, man? Can't you see I'm blind? I give the man some money, and he walks away, and Ovidio says, concerned, he looks sick or something, don't you think? Can't get no stinking SSI in this country. When he was in Massachusetts, he had worked answering phones at a middle school, and when he lost that job, he had applied for disability, but been denied. He says, I could try again. You gotta work that system, but here, there ain't no system to work. We decide to go to the bus gate where I'm gonna get on the bus, and I take my fanny pack that I've shoved some money into, and I wrap it around his waist and tell him to hide it under his clothes. Then I lean down and I kiss him on the cheek. He looks up at me, surprised. He says, this isn't my first kiss. And I said, no, I didn't think it would be. Then he starts fake crying really, really loudly and yelling at the top of his lungs, for the love of God, don't leave me. I didn't mean it. Please don't go. And then he grabs my arm, pulls his chair towards me, and buries his face in his hands. Everyone in the entire bus station is staring at us. He grins at me through the cracks in his fingers and says, you know they think you're heartless. I laugh, kiss him again, and walk through the bus gate smiling. When I climb on the bus, I look out the window, straining to see, but he's already gone. When I get home, and I always cry at this, when I get home, I pull a book off the dusty shelves in the basement. Ovid, The Metamorphoses. These are the first lines. It is my intention to tell of bodies changed to different forms. The gods who made these changes will help me, or so I hope, with a poem that runs from the world's beginning to these our own days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louisa. What I want to do with the remaining time that we have is to just ask Louisa a few questions about how this story came to be and what this means. And then I'll certainly open it up to you all to ask questions as well. But Louisa, actually, she sent me questions. I guess I'm
always send them questions.
I guess I'm not a trusted interviewer here. So Louisa, how did you come to write and to then start telling the story?
So I actually wrote this story like as it was happening. So this story itself is like 20 years old. I mean, I was in Mexico like writing it down. And then when I started doing, thank you for coming by. When I started doing reality storytelling, which is like a thing, have you guys seen The Moth? You know The Moth? So there's like an offshoot of The Moth in Atlanta called Carapace. When I started doing Carapace on a regular basis, this was one of the stories that I told, but you're actually only allowed to have 7 minutes. That's why it's exciting to do this here, because I think it took me about 15 minutes to tell this story. So you can imagine if I cut it in half, it would lose a lot of its like punch. But to get 15 minutes, you have to be like the headliner at a storytelling festival. But anyway, so I don't know, and there's some kind of magic about it that I don't know exactly why this means as much to me as it does, this event, but I have gotten some ideas about it as we've gone through this process.
So can you say a bit more about what this story means to you then?
Yeah. I think that that was like that moment in which I was like boarding a plane to fly to Mexico was probably like the lowest moment of my life. It was like the most pain that I had ever been in. And when you feel like totally hopeless and then you meet someone totally surprisingly out of the blue, a person that you also wouldn't necessarily think that you have anything in common with, and the spirit connection between you and that person. And by spirit connection, I just mean somebody that you just like, you really like immediately, and you think they're hilarious, and you guys have this incredible connection out of the blue. Was basically, it was a gift from God. And it was a gift from God that tells you, like, you know, it's okay, go on. You know, it's okay, you know, you feel like your life is over right now, but it isn't. And that's why this story means as much to me as it does.
Is it difficult to talk about loss publicly?
I think it's super important to talk about loss publicly. I think as Americans, culturally, we tend to be like really uptight about, you like learn from an early age, don't talk about sad things, don't talk about loss. But when you talk about loss publicly, it gives people permission to like be authentic. And if you don't have authentic relations with people, you can never heal from loss, because it is authentic relations with people that allows us to heal from loss. So there are ways to protect yourself. I do know that like you can, like, I mean, I used to have a friend who was a performance artist, and he would be like so depleted after every single show that he did because he was like revealing too much of himself, and then he would have exposure anxiety. There are ways that you can keep that from happening. Like when I say the first 3 sentences of this story telling you like what the circumstances are, you need to know that in order to be like able to engage with like why this is happening and what the content is. But I don't go into huge amounts of detail about like my broken relationship and my mother's death. Not that you can't. I mean, there are people who do like Tig Notaro and other people who do an amazing job, but I think you have to be prepared for that. But you can just sort of mention it as background context and then get into something else.
Was your mother mad at you for taking a week off or she was stage 4 pancreatic cancer? Not exactly the proudest moment of her daughter, I would think.
I think she was super proud of me, actually, for getting on an airplane to deal with myself emotionally. Because if you're a basket case, you can't really be helpful to someone who's sick. So everybody, she also was sick for a year before she passed. It wasn't like she was imminently passing at that moment. But I think that, you know, as all of you guys know, from people who have done caretaking with individuals with severe terminal illnesses, severe mental health issues, like if you don't take care of yourself and like get yourself together, you're not going to really be of help to the person that you're taking care of.
What other questions do you all have for Louisa?
I got a question.
Mm-hmm.
So you set the bar pretty high. Right?
I'm a professional. Don't try this at home.
So what are some of the techniques in storytelling to find
Well, I was going to tell you. Yes. What are some of the techniques that you use in storytelling? I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to take this minute to plug our upcoming storytellers, and then I'm going to answer the question. On March 24th, we're going to have Ethel Ware Carter, who is not able to be here today. On May 5th, we're going to have Carl Walker. On September 1st, we're going to have Melinda Snow. Melinda, can you stand up, please? So come and see Melinda on September 1st. And Bob Miller is our 4th storyteller. Bob, stand up. We are currently in really tough legal negotiations for a date scheduled for Bob. But I'm going to email all of you individually to make sure you come to see him.
March 13, 2025.
Okay.
After hearing that performance.
So to answer your question, I do think I spent it's funny because we also did like a storytelling workshop orientation together. That I do, and if you're interested in hiring me, my email address is No, really, I do. And, I looked for stories online for I thought, I'm going to find a story online that I can show as an example of just sort of having from beginning to end these basic elements. And it took me like 8 hours to find a story that I felt like kind of did all of it. And it's super basic that you have to be like animated when you tell your story. That's super important. And people feel like it's going to be overly exaggerated and they're going to look dumb, but it isn't. Like there's this one woman, I told this in the orientation, there's this one woman on TEDx. There's a lot of stories on TEDx who has this incredible story about, like, of all things that could happen to a human being. She's standing in the fog in Great Britain and something hits her and she falls down and doesn't know what's happened until she wakes up in the hospital, and a stag has run into her and stabbed her in the chest with its antlers. Now you would think that that is like just a no-brainer story to stand up and tell, but I swear to you, you can Google it. Like, you can go watch it yourself. She's like, so then I was stabbed in the chest by a stag. What? You know, like, I mean, you have to, like, you know, you gotta be willing to, like, exaggerate a little bit, because when you're reading something, you can go back over and reread it, but when you're listening to something, you only got one shot, and so it's different than, like, regular hearing. You have to allow the audience an opportunity to, like, hear it, and basically all you're trying to do is you're trying to make the audience feel like they were there while the event was happening. And you can do that through emotion, through visual, sensorial cues. You gotta be careful, like when you're doing accents. I asked this as a genuine question. Did anyone think that I was being racist when I did the Mexican accent? No. Okay. And you can ask why, because you could have somebody doing an accent that does not belong to them culturally and it could just be racist. And you gotta be really careful. Imitation is a good way to get people to feel like they're in the story. But I think because I loved him so much, that what I'm doing is trying to convey to you the spirit of him that I loved. And so I'm not doing like a cultural stereotype, because I'm talking about this individual that like transformed my life in a very short period of time. Yeah.
Do you know where he is now?
I don't. Do you know where he is now? I don't. I actually like searched for him on Facebook, because you never know, like, you can find people. Like, I ran away with a rock and roll band in Spain 20 years ago. They're still online and rocking it hard. Their name is Buster, B-A-Z-T-E-R, if you want to look them up. I sang with them. But anyway, him I couldn't find. So, but, you know, so I don't know. So we just say, like, a prayer, and he's still living with me, obviously, like, to this day. Yeah.
Sorry. Melinda.
But they say that angels are messengers of God. Is he not an angel?
Yeah, I think he is. Absolutely. They say that angels are messengers of God. Is he not an angel? Yeah. Yes, he is. Absolutely.
And how does the fact that you've encountered an angel change your notion of meeting and communicating?
It's almost as if I gave you that question. Ask me, because I want to say this. Yes, she said, how does meeting an angel change your sense of God and meeting? Did I do it? You said it better than that, but did I do it okay? So I think that, I told you I could never be in an event where I don't talk about refugee ministries. Yeah, that's right. So here it comes. I think that, you know, when people think about service work, they think about like doing something for others. And I think about it as like the opportunity, if you're really lucky, to like have joy. And it doesn't necessarily happen like all the time. You just like with anybody, you're not like, you know, like, oh, I really connect with this person's okay, but I don't like come alive when I'm with them. It can happen, and it can happen especially when you are like, you understand fundamentally that other cultures, people of color, living in poverty, they can have these amazing gifts. And it's not some kind of like minimizing, racist, the beautiful savage kind of imagery. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying real individuals who have been through incredible experiences and have amazing interpersonal resources to offer you. This last week, Refugee Ministries helped a transgendered woman. You guys know what transgendered woman is. Someone who was born a male and transitioned to be a woman, who was from Guatemala, flee. Because she had come here, she had gotten asylum, which means she had gotten refugee status, which is incredible. And shocking that that happened this day and age. And she was discriminated against at her job. Her job wouldn't let her use the bathroom without a letter from a lawyer. And then when that didn't work, because Land Illegal got involved, they tried to fire her in a different way. When she lost her job, her family became a situation of domestic violence, which happens often with trans people. And so All Saints Refugee Ministries paid for her to, literally, I was talking to her on the phone while someone was beating her, take an Uber from far away to get to the Atlanta bus station, and we paid, she had to flee with nothing because it's domestic violence, so we paid for her to have some supplies. This is the kinds of things that your wonderful donations do. And then we put her on a bus to San Francisco, where she could hopefully find some space. But during the 2 hours that I was able to spend with her, while we were waiting, like, you know, I've actually never had, it's surprising because, you know, my partner teaches queer studies at Georgia State University, among other things. I've actually never had a conversation with a trans woman before. And we, like, not in depth like that, and we just, like, hit it off. And we were laughing, and, like, there's this thing in queer studies where instead of everything's gendered in Spanish, masculine, feminine, Latino, Latina, and so they try to get rid of the gender by saying Latinx. So we were like, just go with me. It's a little bit of detail. Go with it. So we're like laughing and saying like, oh my God, what do you do if you say Latinx? You're gonna make everything gender neutral. And so she's like, ay, que eres muy bonitex. Which means, bonitex. And we just like hit it off. And I guarantee you, that was an interaction that I'll never forget. And that woman in a moment of trauma, I'm sure that she appreciated the clothing and the bus ticket, but the most important thing to her, I know this for a fact, is the 2 hours of connection that we spent together. So that's kind of how this connects to the like broader piece.
What other questions do you have?
Well, do you think that it was necessary to leave your regular life and travel to kind of get a different frame of mind?
Absolutely, I do. Yeah.
I do think that it was necessary. Answer the question.
Oh, do I think it was necessary to travel and leave my regular life in order to like kind of get it together and get a perspective? Absolutely, I do. Yes.
So do you try to stay still in your life?
Fortunately, I'm not in like really deep, serious chronic pain like at this point. So it's not like as necessary. Like that was like an emergency situation. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's good like life-work balance. If you can, we don't get to do it nearly often. My partner and I and our child don't get to do it nearly often enough, but we try. We're gonna hit Kevin Lyman up to use his lake house. Like,
I want to ask a question, Louisa.
Sure.
That you don't have to repeat.
Okay.
So, I don't know if you all know this, but Louisa's father is a priest in the Episcopal Church. And so presumably you grew up hearing sermons a lot. And I'm wondering, is there a relationship to you between preaching sermons and storytelling? And did you see that as having, I mean, I felt like you preached for us today, but I wonder, like, do you see those connections and those relationships?
I mean, my father is actually an outstanding preacher. So yes, I'm sure that I learned like language. My parents were both like really big literature people. My father still is. His reading is too highbrow for me. He like gives me these books and I'm like, God, could I just have like some like chicklet, please? You don't have any chicklet? Okay, so they're like highbrow literary people, and he's a really good preacher. So yeah, absolutely, that was in my constitution. I've never really thought about like me like being a preacher until you just said that, because that kind of freaks me out a little bit. But yeah, definitely like the language and all that is something that my parents gave me. You had a question?
Yes. I was wondering if you were already working like with refugees, equal rights at that time.
Oh, that's a great question.
Did that kind of?
That's a really good question.
Of that, did that?
So that would have been 1999. So I had come.
And it bears repeating.
Oh, sometimes I'm a good public facilitator, and then when it's all about me, I'm not. So that's a great question. When this story happened, were you already working with refugees or thinking about social justice issues, and did that allow you to enter into this situation? In 1999, I have a master's degree in Spanish. It's really a literary degree. Like Spanish and Latin American literature. So I had gotten that in 97. So at this time I was teaching undergraduate courses in Spanish to university students. So I had that I had to read like a lot of books in Spanish, like literature in Spanish there were like 500 being tested on my comps. So I think that allowed this to occur. I mean, I had to be able to speak Spanish even though he spoke English to like sort of, and I feel like in literature, this is something that I'm coming back around to. Like last night I went to an Audre Lorde event. You guys know who Audre Lorde was. So I just think that like Audre Lorde you're like, tell him who Audre Lorde is. Gotcha. Audre Lorde she passed, it doesn't matter when. She passed, but she's an amazing African-American lesbian poet and author who talks about the importance of reclaiming language and literature for social justice and activism. And last night at this event, language was framed as action, and I really needed to hear that last night. I think that's amazing, because right now, during this time, like, we need stories, we need words, and so I think that talking about these kinds of things is, so I got political activism inside of me from literature. I didn't have a ton of experience like interacting with people at that time, but I have an incredible legacy in me from having read the literature of other cultures, which is incredible and resourced. And I mean white people too, I mean white people most of all, need that, because we are not resourced for coping. We do not have that cultural legacy. Unfortunately, we have a cultural legacy that tends to prioritize profit. And if we want to really change the world, we need the legacy of these rich heritage, African-American civil rights and literature and other cultures. We need that to be able to function. Now I'm preaching. Who wants to come up and be healed? I can do it. I've never done it before. Do not try this at home, but I can do it. I'm just kidding. Is that on tape? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.